welcome back to another episode of the MRMIA broadcast. I'm your host, Marc Leprince, and this is the Model Risk Managers International Association broadcast. Today we have with me Bart, who's one of the co-authors of the book Managing Model Risk, here to talk a little bit more about his book, what he's learned, and what he's going to share with us today. So Bart, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Marc. So my name is Bart Baesens. I'm a professor of big data and analytics at the Catholic University of Leuven, which is located in Leuven in Belgium. I'm also a guest professor at Southampton Business School, which is situated in Southampton in the United Kingdom. My research is big data and analytics, and basically what I do is I study the development of new ways of analyzing data. More specifically, I study the development of new algorithms, but I also study innovative applications of these algorithms in very specific application fields, ranging from credit risk modeling to fraud detection to marketing analytics, etc. So that's more or less in a nutshell what I do.
So that's quite a range of modeling experience here. And so let's talk a little bit more about this book. So what kind of prompted you to write the book,
Well,
Managing Model Risk?
that's actually a very good question. I've been working in analytics together with my colleague and co-author, Professor Seppe van der Broeke, for more than 20 years now. And we worked both with industry, so we did quite a lot of consulting projects, which we implemented ourselves, but which we also supervised. But we also did a lot of research on data science, big data, and analytics. And throughout these both experiences, the industry experience on the one hand and the research experience on the other hand, we found that model risk was a very important issue as you were developing analytical models and also validating them. Because there's no such thing as the perfect analytical model. In fact, if you think about it a little bit more closely, as soon as an analytical model gets implemented, it is outdated. So every analytical model comes with a certain degree of model risk. And me and my co-author, Seppe van der Broeke, started brainstorming on it. And we said, why don't we write a book on it? Because all of the anecdotes, the practical experiences, but also the research projects that we supervised gave us enough ingredients to come up with a table of content. And that's how we basically started writing this book.
Oh, it's very nice. So then kind of walk me through the breadth of what you cover in the book. Um,
That's a very good question. Basically, we started from the CRISP-DM, which is cross-industry standard process model for data mining. We used that as a reference model to talk about model risk. And the reason why we did this, Marc, is because we think model risk is embedded in every step of the analytical modeling process. It starts with data risk. Then it continues on with specification risk, like how are you going to specify a target variable that you wish to optimize for? If you want to model customer lifetime value, for example, how are you going to define that? If you want to model default risk in a credit risk modeling setting, how are you going to define default? But it goes even further. It goes into development risk, like if you have areas where you have a lot of domain expertise, how are you going to embed that? Are you going to go for supervised or unsupervised analytics? Sometimes the distinction is not that clear cut. What algorithms are you going to use? Are you going to use black box algorithms such as deep learning methods, or are you going to use white box modeling techniques like more regression, decision tree methods? The choice is not that always that evident. How are you going to evaluate those models? The next step is obviously validation. That's really important. Far too often in our collaborations with firms, we've seen the very important phenomenon of data leakage, for example. And data leakage means that models are not appropriately and adequately validated since you have data leaking between a training and test set. And it happens even in a very inconspicuous way without modelers being aware of it. Far too often we've seen that happening such that the model validation was actually too overly optimistic and gave us a wrong impression of model performance. But it's also about the operationalization of the models, how you can operationalize models in a user-friendly way, such that they can also easily be backtested, be monitored, and so on. And there's also things like security, ethics, and privacy risks that come with model development. And finally, last but not least, there's the whole managerial aspect. How do I get enough trust in my models? How can I make sure that my C-level executives remain on board during the entire model development, but also model production and deployment process? Because again, far too often we've seen beautiful analytical models not being ended up getting successfully deployed because the C-level executives did not support them, did not trust them, did not understand them, etc. So it was embedded. Model risk is something that is embedded throughout the whole trajectory of analytical model development. And it's exactly this breadth that we try to cover by providing a unique blend of both academic and industry experience.
Yes. And Bart, I have to say that is extremely comprehensive, because one of the things that we always try and go over the show is just how much of a team sport this really is. That even though it is the second line's responsibility to perhaps validate
Mhm.
the model and do all the checks, right? A lot of this data work, the development decisions are being taken on by the first line. And, you're not making these decisions in a nutshell. The
No,
business has a lot of say into what kinds of models they want to see, the performance they want to see, and the risk they're willing to take on. And
yes,
so you not only have to be able to interface with the developers and speak statistics, but you also need to talk to the senior leadership and be able to communicate business impact. And
yes.
so, yeah, I'm really excited that your book kind of covers
Yeah.
the whole breadth of everything.
Yeah. I think what's really important to build further upon your insight, and I fully
Hmm.
agree with you, Mark, on this, is alignment. And you have to have alignment between different parties that are involved in the analytical modeling process. And as
Hmm.
you correctly point out, it's not only about the data scientist, but you have to have the business people on board. You have to have the marketeers on board if you're working in fraud, the fraud investigators, the credit experts if you're working in credit risk modeling. All of these people you have to have on board, but also the legal folks, because there's more and more data that becomes available to be leveraged from an analytical perspective. But where do we start to get into the legal, let's call it danger zone, where we
Hmm.
start to see privacy threats, ethical challenges, and so on? So that's where the legal folks also have to step in. And obviously, the final step is the sign off by the C-level executives. And also, these people should be involved from the outset of the analytical model development. And that's why one of the topics that we also extensively zoom in the book is corporate governance. C-level executives should specify clear guidelines, procedures, organizational responsibilities should be assigned to various types of parties such that, and you phrase that really nicely, analytical model building is a team effort throughout the
Yeah.
entire enterprise, and everybody should be on the same page, perfectly aligned, such that we can create strategic competitive advantages with it.
Yeah, so let's dive more a little deeper into that corporate governance structure,
Yes,
because one of the things that we're seeing right now is that the banking industry has really kind of grown a lot, primarily because of regulations, right? It's required by
yes,
regulations to
yes,
track and perform model risk. And we're starting to see now model risk pick up in other industries, manufacturing,
yes, yes.
and specialty finance, right? Not true banks, but they're starting to
Yeah,
pick it up. Insurance companies are starting to come out with model risk, and finally, even big tech, uh, things like
yeah.
Google and Facebook. So, because they're not regulated, they don't necessarily have kind of a structure in place. So, what are some of the things that you think are important to have in a corporate governance structure to ensure model risk has the space to grow within a company?
A very important question. And you're very right. The idea of model risk originated from all types of regulatory guidelines like the Basel Accords,
Mhm.
Solvency II, IFRS 9, which heavily stress the importance of model risk. And one of the ideas that we picked from there, and which we also elaborate on, and which also apply to other settings beyond credit risk, like fraud analytics, like marketing analytics, and so on, is the idea of model audit. And that's something that I would wish to briefly elaborate on. So nowadays, if you look at many credit risk modeling departments, you will see that you have two subgroups in there. So you have a modeling department, a modeling team, let's call it a modeling team who's going to develop the models, and you have an audit team. And there's a Chinese wall in between both, right? Because there should be independence between the audit team and the modeling team. And the audit team's core responsibility is to continuously challenge, audit, and find weaknesses or shortcomings in the models which are being developed by the developing team, by the development team. And by giving that feedback, you create an environment of continuous model perfection. Now that comes with certain types of corporate governance challenges, because far too often we've seen that the human factor in setting up this infrastructure is really very important. You don't want your model auditing team to be perceived as a watchdog of the model development team, because that is not a constructive way of collaborating at all. So what we suggest, one of the ideas that we suggest in the book, for example, is the idea of rotational employment. And rotational employment means that on a model by model basis, we guarantee that Chinese wall separation
Mhm.
between the modeling team and the audit team, but that may change as we move from model A to model B, such that we have a continuous spillover effect of knowledge, of modeling knowledge, between the auditors and the developers. And that's what we strongly advocate in the book, because that creates a very fruitful environment to develop state-of-the-art, high-performing analytical models and to continuously learn. Because what's really important is that I think the world of analytics is continuously evolving. We have new technologies that are being developed on an ongoing basis. So it's really important that we are aware of those and how to successfully implement them into our analytical modeling efforts.
Yeah, that is very, very key. And I think one of the and if you could speak on this, because I know many of my, personal colleagues are actually struggling with this, is
Mhm.
being able to open that communication with the first line so that it becomes more collaborative. Because just as you said,
Yes,
it's
yes,
not supposed to be watchdogs. It's not
no,
supposed to be someone constantly nitpicking over your shoulder of what you did
right.
right and wrong. It's supposed to be working together with that still, independent separation. And so, what kinds of advice or um, do you have for encouraging that kind of collaboration?
Well, to encourage that collaboration, as one of the ideas which I mentioned is, for example, rotational employment,
Hmm.
right, where you kind of rotate your personnel on a model by model basis between the modeling and the auditing team. What's also very important, obviously, is that the auditing team gives their recommendations in a constructive way.
Hmm.
That's really very important, that clear recommendations are being given in a way which is constructive and which is really incremental. That's really
Right.
very important. Nobody wants to start their model building again from scratch, but there's always tricks of the trade that you've learned on how you can perfect the performance of existing analytical models. And one such trick of the trade, which we also cover in the book, is, for example, the topic of feature engineering, clever feature
Hmm.
engineering. Feature engineering is something that can be highly automated, because that's typically what techniques like deep learning do. They do automated feature engineering, or can be also human-centered. That means that your feature engineering starts from the expert provided, from the insights provided by the experts. And I think that's where the model auditing team also can create added value in a very constructive and incremental way. right? And that's the second guideline that I can give. Give
Mm-hmm.
your feedback, your model feedback, do your model auditing with a constructive, incremental mindset. That's really important because that will allow to continuously perfect your models instead of having to rebuild them from scratch, right? Which nobody wants to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. So, yeah, that's very, very important. So, I'm going to change tracks a little bit, and I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into one of the things you first mentioned, um, which is the concept of data risk. So,
Hmm.
as we kind of move along the whole breadth of mall risk management, um, most teams often think their job begins and starts with the model, right? That's
Hmm.
the name, model risk management. But you made a distinct effort to actually cover the importance of data because, as we all know, the input of the data, the structure of the data, the training data you use is very important to how the model gets created and therefore the output it creates. So can you give us a little overview of data risk and dive into some of the key things that mall risk managers should keep an eye out for?
Yeah, I can. So first of all, there's a very important issue of data bias, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because how an analytical model is being developed is you take a sample of historical data and you build an analytical model on that. Now, it's really important to be aware that a sample is always biased up to a certain extent, because it's conditional on the strategy the firm was adopting at that very moment. It's conditional on the macroeconomic environment. Think about the COVID pandemic we're facing right now, but it's also conditional on the endogenous traits of the customers within that sample, which are continuously evolving because customer behavior is continuously evolving. So every sample that you take is to a certain extent biased, but this need not be a showstopper for developing analytical models. The only thing that you should be aware of is the bias of your sample, to what extent it is biased, such that you can actually qualify it and understand the impact on the model development afterwards. This is something that we elaborate on. Next, there's the whole scope of the data parameter, for example. Right? What's the range of the data that is being covered? Right? I develop a model using a set of Canadian SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. Um, Now, suppose that I do a merger or an acquisition of a portfolio of American SMEs. What's the validity range of my model? Does the model that has been developed on Canadian SMEs, can it be generalized? We call that out of universe validation to
Mm-hmm.
those American SMEs, yes or no? That relates to data perimeter. Lack of predictive power. Far too often, we've seen that people ask us to build an analytical model and they immediately expect excessively high lift values, amazingly high AUC, area under the ROC curve values, and so on. But what if you cannot live up to those standards? What if you cannot uh, deliver a model with an AUC above 70%? 70% for some reason is always considered like a magical threshold. Everybody wants their AUC above 70%. So we give also recommendations if there's lack of predictive power. We give recommendations on what type of external data sources may be relevant, how to enrich your data using data transformations, using feature engineering, and so on. And another topic that we address is everybody talks about big data, and you already referred to the idea of very specific finance projects, project finance, for example. Sometimes we still face small data cases where we don't have a lot of data available. Think about very specific products like project finance, which is a type of finance for building nuclear reactors, bridges, railway stations, etc. But also think about new products which are being shipped on a continuous basis. There we have to wait a certain amount of time to amass a critical set of data, which we can then analyze. But in the absence of data, you can rely on, for example, domain knowledge. And one technique that we briefly touch upon in the book is Bayesian probabilistic networks, which provide you the ideal mix between learning from data and combining that with domain knowledge in a particular setting. And finally, another topic that I can think of the top of my head is, what about incomplete or noisy labels? So when you have a target, and this is typically what you see in fraud analytics, your target will be very noisy because fraud transactions, there's always a level of suspicion in there, right? So how were transactions labeled as being fraudulent, yes or no? The best way to do that is by waiting for a court judgment and have a judge say, look, this is fraud, this is not fraud. But in many firms, there's human experts, fraud investigators, that at a certain moment in time are going to decide, look, these are fraudulent ones, these are not fraudulent ones. But these fraud investigators not always agree, which makes that your target every now and then is noisy. So how to cope with that is also one of the topics that we zoom into.
Yeah, that's all very, very important. Because
Yeah.
I mean, it again, it
Yeah,
all boils down to identifying the signal and the noise, but
that's right.
just the breadth that you're able to cover from the scope of the data to, small subsets of data and how you identify which one's trustworthy or not. I mean, this is just really, really fascinating. Um, so, um, I'm gonna I kind of bring this to a close here. So one of the things that I like to do is kind of ask, because you and your co-author have been working in this space for over 20 years each. Is there a favorite part of model risk that you guys really like, or something that you come back to time and time again?
Yes, there's a favorite part of it, right? And that's I mean, what interests both me and my co-authors are
Hmm.
challenges, right? And
Yeah.
model risk is a very important challenge because the thing is, throughout the book, we will identify various sources of model risk. We will also present various solutions to deal with these sources of model risk. But the thing is that model risk is something that you can never totally get rid of. So at a certain point, you will have to learn with a certain minimal amount of model risk, because data will always, to a certain extent, be imperfect. Models will be imperfect. There will be deployment risk, production risk, there will be security threats, and so on. So continuously thinking about these challenges is something which triggers us, which keeps us on our tiptoes. To think about that in a clever, smart, and creative way. Another thing that intrigued us is that as we thought more closer about this whole idea of model risk, is that it is embedded throughout the entire analytical modeling process in various ways, in various, sometimes even strongly interacting ways. And that's also something that strongly fascinates us, and that was one of the key takeaways from this book.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Well, Bart, I really appreciate you spending the time with us, giving us a chance to get a quick look at the book and cover some of the key topics that you guys cover. So, thank you so much for spending the time with us. And to the listeners out there, I hope you guys join us next time.
Thank you very much.